Joining us here today on Green with Envy, we have a special guest from The Athletic and former director of basketball research from the Milwaukee Bucks. We have Seth Partnow joining us. How's it going, Seth?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, we're excited to get you on here. So one of the big reasons that we wanted to have Seth on, besides his just amazing basketball knowledge, is recently on The Athletic, you put out your tiers list, your player tiers list of the top 125 players broken up into 5 different tiers. And on this show, Greg and I, we've gone back and forth a bunch talking just about a very similar type mold where within this league, there are certain stars, all-stars, superstars, and we too often fall to default to naming players in these tiers where they don't really belong. And it's all these different tiers that can be broken down into subsections. You did an amazing job of this. Love the work that you've done. If you haven't checked it, go hit The Athletic, pay for that subscription. Trust me, you need it. But Seth, if you could, tell us a little bit about how this tiers list came to be. And I'm assuming this is something you started with the Milwaukee Bucks and now have brought to a public consumption level with The Athletic.
Sure. So there's actually, it's a pretty widespread practice around the league. And I'm pretty sure it came out of the San Antonio organization. Like every team has, not every team, but a bunch of teams have their own version of it. It's, for the Spurs, I believe it's known as the SSQ, the Spurs Standard of Quality. And it's sort of rating players at, various levels, franchise, in that version of its franchise core, top starter, starter, key reserve, rotation player, depth, veteran presence, I think are the levels. And then not Spurs quality or not Bucks quality or not whoever quality is sort of the bottom tier. And so that's an exercise that most teams, most front offices go through, some more formally than others. And I think that the thing you hit on is sort of defaulting towards, I guess, optimism. Was sort of the genesis of this project to begin with. What does a franchise player mean? Arguably, there could be 30 franchise players, or maybe it's something smaller. And so, based on some research that Kevin Pelton had done in the past, and then I kind of looked at it further. If we're trying to win a championship here, which players really matter towards that? And if you go back and research, the last 20 years of NBA history, there are some kind of they're not really cutoffs, but there's spots where you can draw some lines. The top, 3, 5, 7 players at any one time are on one level. The next 10, 15 or so are on another level. The next 25 or so on another level, and on down. And that's sort of where the tier idea of the tiers came from. Isn't like there are 5 top 5 players, but it's tier 1 is in that 3, 5, 7, that range of players, depending on, how many guys at any given time are performing at that sort of exalted level and on down the line. And and once you get to that and realize you have a sort of a target number in each group, is being really, I don't want to say judgmental, but really nitpicky almost, especially at the top. This is the Celtics show, so I know you guys want to say that Jason Tatum is a top X player. Is Jason Tatum is Jason Tatum as good as Giannis? No. Is Jason Tatum as good as Joel Embiid? Okay, you might differ. You might disagree with me.
It's closer. I'll say that.
No, it's closer, but no. Like, is Jason Tatum as good as Anthony? No. Okay. Is Jason Tatum as good as Damian Lillard? Now we're talking. Mm-hmm. I think Dame is we'll get there, but Dame is a half step up for me. But that's at least a discussion. So now we've kind of narrowed the range of where Tatum can be to, I think, a more realistic area. And tier 2 where he ends up, and again, I'm stepping on later on the show.
Oh, you're good.
But that's that. The question that I think is always a little reductive is, can he be the best player on a title team? For any of the top 20, 25 players in the league, yes, they could be. It's just harder. It's much harder for the 20th best player in the league to be the best player on a championship team, just because of the difficulty in putting enough around him than it would be for the 3rd, 4th, 5th best player in the league. And so that's one. I think that's a big aspect of the tiers. It's just sort of identifying who, in my judgment, most moves the needle towards winning a championship right now.
we talk about Jaylen Brown, we're just going to go completely off script here, Will, if that's cool.
Let's roll with it. Let's roll.
Seth kind of led us there. I was actually hooping this morning, and I was talking to some dudes. I was like, "Hey, I'm actually going to have Seth Partnow on the show later and talk about the tiers article." And they're like, "Oh, that's crazy." And it got me thinking about Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, right? So Jason Tatum, I think one of the reasons why right now he might not be as important to the Celtics' success is because he's so far away from being at the top of what his potential is, right? You have him as a 3C, I think. And to me,
Jaylen Brown, not Jason Tatum.
Jason Tatum, what do you have him as?
I have him as a 2C.
Okay, 2C. So you have Jason Tatum as a 2C. And I think Celtics fans need him to be, and the Celtics organization need him to be closer to the ones, right? Where Jaylen Brown, I think his potential, his highest potential, is probably around this 3 range. Maybe he could get into the 2s, but that's kind of what he's going to be, right? Jason Tatum is much farther away from what the Celtics need him to be than what Jaylen Brown is for the Celtics. And I think right now, Jaylen's probably going to top out in the 3s, maybe 2C. So I was just wondering your thoughts on Jaylen Brown versus Jason Tatum.
No, I think that's a you're almost framing it as a negative. I would put it the other way. There's not that many players who have real equity to be a top 5. When I say top 5, I don't mean 5. I mean, that group, that tier 1 group. There's not that many players who have equity to grow into that level. And the fact that you can even say he's far away from where we need him to be sort of implies a belief that he can get there. And would I bet on him ever being a top 5 player in the league? Probably not. If you're offering me 50-50, is there a chance that he puts together his shooting and ball handling and defense kind of all together at once at the very top level, and he performs at sort of a super Paul George level almost? Because Paul George is frankly he's been maybe a top 10, but never really a top 5 player in the league, and so that's we're talking about comparing it. Like Paul George is a all-time a Hall of Fame player, and and if he's not quite there, and Jason Tatum needs to be better than that, that's the small target we're aiming at. But to even have that conversation about him, I think says a lot about how well that draft pick, that retaining him, giving him the keys to the franchise, how well that's gone. There's not that many guys that happens for.
Yeah, and I think that's so important with this tiers, and the way that you look at it is to actually parse out what is the difference. And especially I think when you get to that, tier 3 level, there's some very important distinguishing factors that I want us to get to, but I'm also going to reverse engineer this a little bit and take us back. Yeah. I don't want to skip over.
Get the reins, Will.
I know, because I don't want to lose talking about some of these bottom tiers. I think the top end, you're right. That's when we get to championships and talking about who's actually going to play for the Larry O.B. trophy. That's where it really matters. But I find these, tier 5 and who just missed the cut in the tier 4, I do find those fascinating. So one of the things that I'm curious to know from you, Seth, which of these tiers is actually the hardest for you to define?
It turns out because last year, the first time I did it for The Athletic, I decided, and I have no recollection of why I decided this, because we love round numbers or something. I decided that it would be 125. In actuality, if you were doing this, and doing the empirical research on the players who kind of end up in these levels, that 5th group ends up being, top 110 to 150. And so I kind of so there's a little bit of artificiality in limiting it to 125. So while I don't like to rank within tiers, because I think that's kind of silly, because the answer is usually it depends. Like who else you got? I did part of a mock trade exercise a week or so ago, where the group that was controlling the 76ers made a trade that ended up with them getting Robert Williams. Now don't freak out, but no, but how many players, if you're Philly, would you prefer to Robert Williams, just because you already have Joel Embiid? So what does Robert Williams? It doesn't make Robert Williams a worse player, but it does mean that for that team, he makes less sense. Is from a contribution standpoint would be lower. So when you get into these groups, as long as it's sort of in the it depends range. But having to cut down to 125, you do have to make, some choices. I listed in the article kind of the last 5 out and the first 5 in. But if I was, just running it straight with no sort of artificially imposed top end number, it probably would have been 145-ish guys.
Yeah.
And maybe saved myself some grief by including RJ Barrett on there, because
there's a couple
I've heard about
that are certainly missing. But yeah, I think you're right. I think at that point with those, the cutoff line of 125, it just becomes more of, who's the better fit depending on the context of what you're talking about. And, just real quick on your Philly point, they did also signed Andre Drummond this offseason. So I think they could have found some room for Robert Williams in a trade. But, looking at those, let's use that last 5 in, first 5 out to talk about, just tier 5 for a minute here. Sure. And Greg, I'm going to pass it over to you because I know you have someone that you really told me that you thought should be in this, top 125 list, but didn't quite make the cut. So let me pass it over to you.
Yeah, man. So Celtics fans are going to, we're going to remember the bubble forever because I think that we were the better team and we should have beat the Heat. Gordon Hayward's injury killed us. But there was one guy on the Heat in the bubble that probably was their most important offensive player. You could argue Jimmy Butler. You could argue Bam. But Goran Dragic, man. Yeah. Goran Dragic, to me, I was shocked that you left him off the list because you got guys like you got Derek White. You've got Pat Beverly, you got Reggie Jackson, who I know just had a great playoffs. But there's just some guys in there. Devontae Graham. I'm like, Devontae Graham? Who would I rather have, Goran Dragic or Devontae Graham? And I think the answer to me is like, it's got to be Dragic. So what is your beef with Goran, man?
I don't have a beef with him. I had him in tier 4 last year. Time is undefeated, and he was never as good last year as he was the year before, whether that's, him being in his mid to late 30s, whether that's never being quite right from, having the torn plantar fascia he suffered in the finals, whether it's the short turnaround from the bubble, whatever it was. When guys have a kind of a fall off and they play not that many games and they're in their mid 30s, you do have to wonder whether like it's time. The wheels have come. The only person who seems immune to that is LeBron and apparently Chris Paul. Yeah. But we're sort of watching the clock with both of them now too, and so it was that as much as any sort of evaluation that like Dragic, the bubble Dragic from last year was a pretty spectacular player, but I don't know if that guy is going into the 21-22 season. Is that guy still there?
For sure.
If the league perceived that guy is still there, would he still be sort of hanging out on the Raptors roster waiting for something to happen? And I don't want to like outsource my opinion to 29 other GMs, but if he was he's on a not unreasonable contract that's expiring, wouldn't be too terribly expensive to acquire, and nobody has. So what does that say?
For sure. And Devontae Graham just got paid.
And I'm not the world's biggest Devontae Graham fan. I think that the mistakes were made in terms of preferring Devontae Graham to Lonzo Ball. You project him as like a third guard on a championship level team, and a guy who can come in and shoot high volume, high percentage 3 as like your third guard, either playing on or off the ball, off the dribble, what have you. Like that's a very valuable player. I think we see the value of having that extra bit of shot creation every year in the postseason. And so that's where I'm coming from that.
And so, with this tier 5, the way I looked at it, and you already mentioned that this could probably be extended out another 20 to 30 players, somewhere in that range. I really view this tier as these are your quality role players. And some may be young and kind of on the way, but this is really where the quality role players land. And, from a Celtics
this in tier 4. I think
tier 4. Yeah, tier 4. I would qualify them as like high-end role players.
The elite kind of they quote it to the extent that it's not an oxymoron. The elite role players are in tier 4.
Yep, for sure. And so with these quality role players, from a Celtic perspective, Josh Richardson just fell out. He fell out. He was a 5A last year, dropped out. My best guess is he might fall somewhere in that 125 to 150 if we really extended it beyond or beyond the fringe.
He was really bad that year. He wasn't great in Philly 2 years ago, and I kind of gave him a mulligan because he was hurt. And then last year he was again like he seemed like someone who would have really helped Dallas and was just really bad all year. So he's got some rebuilding of reputation to do in terms of my sort of view of him as a player.
And I think that's fair, but I'm curious to know, how much do you think the circumstance and the context of the Mavericks team and what he was asked to do plays a role? Because if you look back to his time in Miami, he had a little bit more ball handling responsibilities on the wing, and that's when he was at his best. But when you have Luka Doncic, who's going to play 35, 40 plus minutes a game, you're not taking the ball out of Luka's hands to give Josh Richardson the ball. So how much do you think that plays into, where his rating or where his tier could be?
I think the Mavericks would love to have Luka play off the ball a little bit more. It's just they don't have anyone on the team to, who's the second best, shot creator on their team is probably Tim Hardaway.
Yeah, exactly.
Or Jalen Brunson, who can't get on the floor in the playoffs. So, I think that if he had been, it's sort of a tautology, but if he was better, he would be better. If Josh Richardson had enough with the ball in his hands that Luka could spend, a couple, 5 or 10 more possessions a game, off the ball. I think Dallas would have done that. It just never really worked out that way. And so that's like that. While you're right, there is some circumstantial thing to it. He has the players who make these tiers have some ability to affect those circumstances as well. To like, no, I'm good enough that you need to find a spot for me to do this thing. Or you're kind of, again, to use another league term, you're just a guy. And right now, based on what we've seen the last 2 years, it's hard to not have Richardson in the category as being just a guy. Not, he was more than that coming out of Miami. It's just the last 2 years haven't gone as well for him.
Yeah. So let's talk about some guys that you actually put into tier 5 with the Celtics.
Sure.
So you got Robert Williams and Dennis Schroeder, newly acquired Dennis Schroeder in tier 5. And I know that you kind of have a soft spot for Robert Williams. I was reading through some of your articles, and you seem to have a liking for him. So what is it about those two players that actually fit the tier 5 criteria for you?
So it's funny. It's one guy I'm probably higher than consensus on, and one guy I'm lower than consensus on. I've never been a Dennis Schroeder guy. I think for how for the non-tax MLE, really good pickup for the Celtics, but again, both from different ways. But Robert Williams is sort of has the archetype of the modern role-playing dive and dunk rim protecting big, while combining that with, I think, and this is something he hasn't necessarily had a chance to show as much in the NBA, although I think we've seen flashes of it, is that his skill level with the ball is higher than he's given credit for. I mean, to the extent that the Celtics have used him in kind of pick and roll and gotten him the ball in sort of short roll situations, he's a much better passer, for example, than he's given credit for. And obviously,
unless he's throwing outlet passes, I don't know if you watch it. He just like fires them at people's ankles.
Yeah. But on top of that, just the obviously the top end elite athleticism at the position is sort of what we're looking at. It's the not quite Clint Capella is basically how I think of Williams. So I've been a big supporter, or not a supporter, but I've liked his game a lot, since scouting him when he was at A&M. So and not much has done anything but enhance that opinion since seeing what he's been since he's been in the league. Now, obviously, there's sort of durability concerns, but part of the assumption of the tiers is assuming health. To the extent I'm taking health into consideration, it's sort of, is this a lingering make me a worse player thing? So I got a lot of flack last year for not having Kevin Durant like 1A. Obviously healthy. Obviously, we've just seen healthy Kevin Durant is one of the best, for my money, the best player in the world right now. Coming off an Achilles, we didn't know. Like he recovered from that injury basically better than anybody else ever has. But it wasn't that like, gee, he might miss some time. It's like, gee, we don't know if he's the same guy after this, what tends to be a pretty debilitating injury. Now, from Schroeder's standpoint, I think he's a guy who has some clear talents, but his best years have sort of been overinflated. 1 year in Atlanta, his kind of best top line statistical year, he got all the minutes and all the touches on a mediocre team and sort of put up some big numbers that way. And then his year in Oklahoma City, he had a nice year, but if you dig in, really, you see that it turns out it helps to be the third ball handler on the floor when the other two teams' best kind of point of attack defenders have to guard Chris Paul and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And if you broke down who guarded whom, with the NBA's tracking data, you saw that he drew the third guy a lot, and that I think that contributed a fair amount to him having a career year that year. Obviously, didn't work out as well for him in last year with the Lakers. It was kind of a tough context. LeBron is a tough person to fit around if you are a ball handler.
Yeah, for sure.
Funnily enough, the only person who kind of warps his teammates' play styles as much as LeBron does or has is Russell Westbrook. So it's almost hard to fully judge a player, especially kind of someone who likes to have a ball handling role alongside LeBron, just because one person is in charge and everyone else plays around that.
Yeah. Let's move on to tier 4 now. I want to talk about some of the players in here. And in this tier, both Al Horford and Marcus Smart from the Celtics perspective ended up here. And I think, and Seth, tell me if you would agree with this, the way that I would kind of define tier 4 would be a mixture of high-end role players. And then towards the very top of this tier, you're looking at potentially some low-end stars. And I think even in your article, you described it as this tier has really 3 different types of players that find themselves in here. It's going to be stars of the recent past. It's going to be some players that are on the way up, and then a guy who, this is where I think Marcus Smart fits in, have defined themselves as that high-end, top-tier role players that we talked about. Tell us a little bit about, how you ended up getting Al Horford, who was actually lower the previous season. Ended up, him and Shai played so well, Oklahoma City had to bench them so they continue to tank for their draft pick. So he actually moved up from 5A to 4B this year. And then Marcus Smart still lives in that 4B and slightly down, but I think that was just more circumstantial. But tell us a little bit about your view on the Al Horford and Marcus Smart being in this tier 4 section.
Al Horford this is maybe slightly inconsistent with my view on Josh Richardson, but Horford has been sort of almost 2 gap years. Obviously, the fit alongside Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons was there was a theory under which it could work, but in practice it just did not. And then last year, like you said, it was very much a you're helping us win a little too much. Why don't you just chill at home? So not really taking much from that. He's again a player who I've always liked a great deal in terms of his defensive intelligence, his ball handling, his passing. I think his time in Philly would have worked a little better if I sort of feel like he was even a less willing shooter in Philly than he was in his last couple of years with the Celtics, and I think that would have made him more useful, kind of as a spacer alongside Embiid and Simmons. But obviously, the fit there just was pretty poor, especially when they were getting not as much as they would have hoped from Josh Richardson as well. So that's if when looking back on it, that's one of my more optimistic calls, I would probably say. In terms of Marcus Smart, I don't know what I need to tell your listeners about, a high level defensive impact player who's gotten better as a shooter. And more importantly, he's a guy who is, even when he wasn't a great shooter, was always a willing enough shooter. Sometimes to his detriment, but a willing enough shooter that he'd get guarded. You get guarded more than
for sure. He has a little gravity.
Yeah, he does, and you compare him to say Ricky Rubio. On a percentage basis, Rubio might even be more accurate, but nobody guards Rubio because he's a hesitant shooter, and people are a guy who's going to put up 7 threes a game. A coach is always worried that he's going to make 4 of them. Mm-hmm. That might be irrational, but that's how the game plan gets put together. So that gives him, at least in the regular season, perhaps more gravity than his than his kind of accuracy numbers might suggest. Jay Crowder might be the perfect example of that in the NBA right now. He's an okay shooter, but he will shoot. So he gets a great deal of respect.
And he only shoots threes at times.
Yeah.
So with you spent some time in the front office with the Bucks. What is Smart's like value, or how do people talk about Smart around the league?
The extremes are extreme. Like the defensive intensity and the physicality and everything. People like that. I think there's a split of opinion on the personality. Like, would he, this is very much, it's one of those things that the same bit of information gets interpreted one way if you like the player versus if you don't. Either he'll bring some snarl and toughness or he's an asshole. Like depending, like if you think he's good at, like if you think skill wise he's good, he brings toughness and leadership. And if you think he's not, or he's overrated from a skill standpoint, then you just you think he'd be a problem in the locker room. And that's sort of a universal thing that I've found talking to people, is those kind of subjective assessments have a way of breaking down along the same lines as your opinion of the player's skill set.
Yeah, let's go to tier 3 here, and really the high end of tier 4 versus tier 3. Let's start there. How do you start to delineate who falls into tier 4 versus tier 3? Because I think once we get to tier 3, we start getting to some true all-stars, some stars in the league, and guys that are legitimate all-stars that are playing in all-star games on a somewhat regular basis. Some of them are a little early in their career to say that it's a regular basis at this point. But how do you start to differentiate between that bottom of tier, or excuse me, the top of tier 4 and that bottom of tier 3?
I think one of the things for the players who are going to reach into tier 3, first of all, for with the exception of sort of centers who are kind of on a different scale, in that their defensive impact can be so much higher even without huge amounts of shot creation. Role player skill sets, I have a hard time ever seeing, for as long as I do this exercise, a kind of a 3-and-D player being higher than tier 4, just because that ball in hand stuff, like, I did a Phoenix radio show a couple weeks ago and was talking about Mikal Bridges and what he would have to do to get into tier 3. And Mikal Bridges is a player I love, but he's low usage, doesn't handle the ball much, doesn't create a ton. And so for all of his shooting versatility and his ability to make plays, 1 bounce, 2 bounce, guard multiple positions, it's hard for him to really get into that spot where he himself is creating a winning context rather than complementing one. And that's a bit squishy, but I don't have a better way of describing it. Now, for the players who do have that sort of ball in hands ability, part of it is, how does this work if the other team knows it's coming? The playoffs have never been more different than the regular season than they are now. Just ask Julius Randle. And so one of the people who's
I love the Knicks jabs, by the way. The Knicks jabs are fantastic. Please keep them coming.
It's at this point it's on brand for me, so whatever. So he obviously had a spectacular regular season, great shot making, great off the bounce creation, and then he gets to the playoffs and Atlanta has a very defined scheme for him, and he had nothing. And maybe his second year as sort of a primary guy, he figures more stuff out, but I haven't seen that yet. And so you in terms of a guy who's going to be a ball in hands driver towards winning a championship, how could you put him on that level, having watched that Atlanta series?
For sure.
I don't think we need to pile on, but it was bad. It was like,
feel free to pile on.
Yeah,
our audience will thoroughly enjoy it.
Julius Randle deserved the All-Star appearance. Maybe the second team All-NBA was a little too far, but he had a great season last year in the regular season. And then, Atlanta sticks a guy on the block and forces him to his left hand, and he kind of looked a little bit lost. Now, that's not completely his fault. The Knicks didn't really do much to get him the ball, put him in any sort of advantage situation ever. But there are players who have to go one on the world and perform better. And the players who can do that, you start to talk about your Devin Bookers, your even though he's not necessarily my cup of tea, Zach LaVine, you start to talk about those kind of players. And, admittedly, LaVine hasn't had the playoff reps, but I think that he has shown a little bit longer term that ability to get a high efficiency shot against a defense that's keyed on him than Randall has. And so you get into the playoffs and you end up needing those kind of tough looks. And so the stars who are in that top 35, 40 range, that starts to be what they can give you. Or they give you such, well-rounded contributions across the board. Like Drew Holiday is not the best offensive guard in the world, but he might be the best defensive guard in the world, and he's a pretty good offensive player and one of the very best defensive players. Now we're talking, and I don't think anyone would confuse. I think most of the players I have who are kind of primary scorers in 4A, we're talking Brandon Ingram, Malcolm Brogdon, Julius Randle. I don't think we would really say many of them are elite or even average defensive players. I think Brogdon's okay in certain situations, but I don't think any of them are close to being elite defenders. And that matters too because who are you going up against when you get into the second round of the playoffs? So Drew Holiday can guard Malcolm Brogdon better than Malcolm Brogdon can guard Drew Holiday. So that's an advantage right there. And that's the kind of thing that puts one above the other.
For sure. And within tier 3, you have two names that are very important to Celtics fans right now, Jaylen Brown and Bradley Beal. I don't know if you guys can hear my little dog barking in the background, but she's going crazy, man. It's driving me nuts. But so we have Jaylen Brown and Bradley Beal both in tier 3, but in different parts of tier 3. So how do you parse out the difference between those two players right now? And would you trade Jaylen Brown for Bradley Beal?
Oof. I mean, that's a complicated question that's sort of outside the scope of the tiers. I am purposefully not looking at contracts, not looking at contract status, not looking at contract amounts. And from a, as crass as the terminology is, from an asset value standpoint, that's tremendously important. Again, to go back to the Knicks, like I have Alex Caruso in tier 5 and RJ Barrett not on the tiers. I don't think there's a team in the world that would trade RJ Barrett for Alex Caruso straight up, considering like everything. And that's part of that is, one's on a rookie deal, one just got paid, one's was 20 and the other one's 27. So 20, like 23 and 27. So, that matters too. So what would you trade Jaylen Brown for Bradley Beal straight up is because it's based on a lot of those factors. What else do you have to include to get to Bradley Beal's number is sort of a consideration. On balance, do I think Bradley Beal is a more championship impactful player right now than Jaylen Brown? Yes. For as good as Jaylen Brown can be defensively, I don't totally trust his offensive game from last year. First of all, the environment of last season was weird. There's just outlier shooting seasons across the board. And his uptick in usage efficiency coincided with the Celtics being worse. Now, that's not his fault, but that's just some weirdness put together. So I'm not quite ready to sort of anoint him yet. If he runs back the same season he had last year, this year, and the Celtics are pretty good, then he probably moves up a slot or two. For Beal, I think a lot of people thought I should have had him higher. Basically, since he became the Wizards' primary guy once John Wall started getting injured and then traded, he's been just about the worst defensive player in the league by some advanced metrics.
Yeah, that's not good.
And again, another guy who also shows up there is Devin Booker. But this is not Beal's fault totally for not having the chance to show it, but just observationally, because defensive metrics for individuals are very tough in the playoffs. Just observationally, like Devin Booker played better defense in the playoffs than he usually plays in the regular season. Now, maybe Brad Beal would do that if the Wizards were, second round conference finals team. He hasn't had the chance to show that, so I just haven't seen it. And so that's kind of the difference there. But he is, one of the, outside of the very elite players, he's one of the best offensive creators in the game today. And as such, he's an annual all-star player and someone who would be extremely useful for any team that has designs on winning a championship that needs a bucket, which is basically any team not in Brooklyn.
Everybody always needs more points. That's the name of the game. That's pretty much it's very simple. But
yeah, but there's a point I want to make there, and this is sort of a differentiation between kind of almost the tier 4 guys and up. Is high level shot creation has never been more valuable. Mediocre shot creation has some value, but that's more of a sort of a floor raising skill than a ceiling raising skill. That's the kind of thing that will, you get someone who can eat usage and take a bad team to a 45 win team. But then you need that kind of elite efficiency level for that 45 win team to become a 55 win team, to move up, to win multiple playoff rounds, because that's the level you're playing at now. So, the Brandon Ingrams of the world who can create a decent shot, but maybe less so a great shot, that has almost a ceiling on how good they are for a top team, because what's that get you, in the conference finals if you're there? I think that gets you beat more often than not.
That's a fair point. One of the things with this tier 3 section that I noticed, if you go through the list of players that are on here and which teams they play for, the teams that you feel pretty good about are the teams that have a guy on here, but he's not their highest ranked guy within the tiers. He's one, and then there's either at least one or two more guys that are coming up into tier 1 and tier 2. And I think it's a really important, delegation as to who it is. And you mentioned a guy like Zach LaVine, and people are really excited. I think Chicago Bulls made some interesting moves. I don't think it necessarily,
That's a word.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, I don't know what to do with it. Should they be in the play-in discussion? Should they maybe be somewhere around that 6th seed? I mean, yeah, but what is their future unless Patrick Williams makes a tremendously unexpected jump? I don't really know what they're doing. And so you see him living here, and it becomes, is that the guy you build around? How much sense does that make if he's your number one option? And so for the teams that do have a guy on this tier 3 list, but then also have somebody in the future tiers, I feel like those are the teams that you got to feel good about going into the season. And if you're trying to extrapolate this out a little bit into the future, and for the Celtics, they do have that. They have Jaylen Brown here that sits in tier 3. And that kind of brings us up into that tier 2 category, where for Greg and I, we've talked a lot about this throughout the season, that there's that superstar, which is going to be that tier 1 that we haven't got to yet. And then these tier 2 players, to me, a lot of them have the opportunity or at times can function as a superstar in a game, in maybe a hot stretch in the season, but they're not quite that guy on a consistent basis like you get from LeBron, Durant, yada, 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 Giannis, obviously. You can go through that list. That list is pretty cemented. I think it's this list here where you see teams that can exceed their expectations based on where their star players go. So let's get into Jayson Tatum here, because this is where he lives. And right now you have him as a 2C. And I'm curious to know, what would be the difference between him being a 2C versus a 2B? Because in that 2B section, Jimmy Butler and Paul George live. And in my mind, it depends on your flavor. I would personally, probably a little bit biased here as a Celtics fan, put Tatum above Butler and Paul George. But I think they live in that same area. So I'm curious what separates them, even as a nitpick. What separates Jimmy Butler and Paul George versus a guy like Jayson Tatum from 2B to 2C?
As much as anything else, track record. And that's, again, through no fault of Tatum's. He's, he's going into his 5th year now. Do I have that right? 5th year. How long have I been around? Fourth year. Yeah.
No, Tatum. Is it?
I don't know. We're all.
Let me gaslight you into no. So, but he had one sort of full year at that level in 1920. Last year, while his numbers were comparable, I think you guys would agree that his impact was maybe a little up and down. And I talked about this in the write-up. Like I went out of my way to give guys who had COVID kind of a little bit of a mulligan. He was reported to have been using an inhaler all year, and it's, if you can't breathe, playing basketball at a high level seems
That's every time I play now.
Yeah, well, tell me about it. I'm fully retired now, but yeah, tell me about it. So I think that's just the biggest one is that, and also I think that his ability to perform at a high level on both ends at the same time. There's still, again, a little bit of a question. I think we have many seasons of Jimmy Butler and Paul George being, if not elite, then close to offensive players and all defense level players. And I think that there is an all defense level player in Jason Tatum. I don't know if that player can come out. I'm not saying he can't. This is not an I don't know as an I don't think so. It's I don't know, and I haven't seen it either way. He can be sort of an all defense level player and a 30 plus usage offensive star at the same time. And I think that's, and again, Jimmy Butler is not a 35 usage guy, but he's also he has a much larger playmaking role also than Jason Tatum does. So I think it's from an offensive centrality standpoint, he's in there. So I think that's the knit I'm picking, if you will. Now I can tell by your face I haven't completely sold you guys, but that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think with Tatum, for me, he's definitely got to increase his ability to dominate with the ball in his hands. Hopefully with Udoka, the Celtics are playing a little bit more of an equal opportunity offense. I think last year we threw Tatum into a lot of situations in which he had to be the primary guy. And earlier you mentioned how Schroeder had his best year when he was actually the third option on the OKC team. So I know you got to wrap up here in a minute, but do you think the Celtics? Okay, do you think the Celtics with Schroeder as that third option, Tatum, Brown, Schroeder, do you think that three-headed monster is going to be enough to kind of like get the Celtics back up into Eastern Conference contender title, or do you kind of see them still on the outside looking in?
I think a lot of things need to go right for them this year. I mean, Horford has to. I think the bigger question than Schroeder is Horford. I think he has to be, he has to be at the level I think he is. Like they have to get between him and Robert Williams, they have to get a ton out of that position. Mm-hmm. Especially you think of the teams they kind of need to go through to get to the conference finals. Like in all likelihood, they'd have to beat at least one of the Bucks and Sixers. And that's a lot of interior power that they need those guys to stand up to. So that's as much as Schroeder. I think it's how much can they get on really both ends from those guys. I think Horford is going to be more important offensively in a similar reason that you're talking about. Like we're taking some of the playmaking load off of Tatum, so he can he's developed into a decent to good passer, but I don't think you would say that among scoring wings that he's an elite playmaker. I mean, I think by comparison, I think Chris Middleton's a better playmaker for teammates than Jason Tatum is.
Yeah, with Tatum, like he can make reads right now, but I think the next level that he's going to have to get to is he's going to have to start manipulating the defense, right? And I think that's the distinguishing factor between him and somebody like a Paul George. I feel like Paul George has gotten a lot better at being able to manipulate the defense, and for me, that's what's going to take Tatum from whatever he is right now, tier 2C, and hopefully get him to, by the end of the season, tier 2A. That's what I'm kind of hoping next year. Seth, you got Jason Tatum tier 2A because I think he can get there.
Okay, well let's so read off the names in tier 2A and tell me if like that's Luka Doncic, Joel Embiid, Anthony Davis. Like that's
a good group.
I think that like yes, you want to see him in there, but I think just reading those names kind of indicates like how big an ask you're making, how steep the mountain gets this close to the top.
Well, how about this? What if they get bumped up to 1, right? Yeah. So those guys get bumped up to 1 and you got some space.
Well, I mean, that would probably mean that some of the other guys in 1 were coming back down too,
do you have a clearly defined number of, I know you had mentioned it was like somewhere around 7.
I think if I got to around 10, then I would pretty strongly consider, okay, these guys are the tier 1 guys, and then these guys are down to tier 2, because then it would be, okay, the tier 1 guys would be Durant, Giannis, LeBron, give or take Kawhi, who's a tough one to sort of parse this year because of the ACL. And then, we could argue where you put like Harden, Steph, Jokic, whether they'd be 1 or 2, but there would still be, I think, a distinction between like those guys and Luka's a guy who could easily jump up this year, I think.
Yeah. I mean, he's the guy I think I would even already, one of the few issues that I'd say issues, it's a nitpick, but one of the few things that I think I would probably already have is Luka in that superstar category, especially one of those guys when you are the offense. If you put him on any team in the league, that's your offense. You have Luka Doncic, you have James Harden. Those guys kind of are their own ecosystem wherever they go. And then, of course, you have to find different ways to complement that. So, looking at Jayson Tatum, what would it take for him to move up? Because like we said, I think a lot of the guys that live in this tier 2 area, they can masquerade as a tier 1 player on any given night or for a small stretch. Is it just consistency that makes the difference makes the biggest difference between tier 1 and tier 2? Or what is it that jumps a player from these two tier levels to that tier 1 level?
So I think it's as much as anything else, ease of building around. Like you said, it's Danny LaRue calls it the him alone test. And, if you have Jayson Tatum, are you a championship contending team by virtue or do you have how much needs to go right in the rest of your team building to be a championship level team? And the answer is, less has to go right with him than it would with Brad Beal. But more has to go right than it would with Jokic or Steph Curry or James Harden. And again, that's a squishy definition, but I think that just stating it that way, like I would think that you would agree with me when I say that, like that you just, you're a little bit, you have to, not just the level of player around him has to maybe be a little bit higher to get there, but the types of players around him are, part of the reason why Durant is one of the great players is it doesn't matter. Kevin Durant is going to be Kevin Durant no matter where. If you need him on the ball, he can be on the ball. You need him to be off the ball. He can, you need him to be a small ball 5 in the playoffs. He can, so it's the freedom you have to just get good players around those top guys and care less about what they look like.
Yeah.
And I think.
And that's so important because, you brought this up, and this is something I talk about a lot on our show here, is that if you look back at the last 20 plus champions or so, obviously we don't have the tiers for the last 20 years, but we all generally know who fits into that.
I've actually done that sort of informally, just for purposes, if nothing else, of kind of like doing like draft evaluation to kind of get a sense of how often like guys at different spots in the draft end up, 1, 2, 3, 4. Like I actually, when I do that, I kind of collapse tiers 1 and 2 just because there's so few like long-term tier 1 guys. It's like, well, LeBron and Kawhi and like Giannis and Kawhi both are tier 1. So you have a 50% chance if you draft 15th, which is nonsense. But
with that point, it makes it so much easier to build around those teams when you have that guy, because the champions over the last 20 years, take out the 04 Pistons, the 14 Spurs, and I don't know what your rankings look like for the 08 Celtics, but that actually crossed me as a team that maybe KG, Ray, and Paul all fit into tier 2. So maybe they didn't have a tier 1 guy. Maybe KG was hanging on. I don't know. But that gets pretty close to saying 3 out of the last 2021 champions.
The 11 Mavericks too. The 11 Mavericks I would throw in there. But you think about like those teams all had so many really good players. Like that 04 Pistons team was loaded.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Ben Walsh, like the starting 5 were all, they had, if in that league, they probably would have had 8 or 9 guys. Like Memo Kerr came off the bench on that team. Like that was they had guys, and the same thing with all those other teams. So almost the volume of top 125-ish players you need to build that team around the tier 2 or even tier 3 guy is just higher.
Yeah, and that's one of my last questions that I want to pose to you here, Seth, is, you did this for Milwaukee. You said other teams have their own version of this to some degree for the most part. So as a team, do you then sit back and look at your roster and obviously try to evaluate, okay, between these tier 5s, we have 8 players on our roster that fit in here. We're feeling pretty good. And then obviously you have to stagger that for, well, we have 2 tier 1 players and we have 4, tier 5 players, so we can kind of make that work more than tier.
You're making room in the trophy case if that's where you end up.
Exactly. Well, I mean, that's to a degree kind of where the Lakers fell with Anthony Davis and LeBron James, and you look at the rest of their roster. So do teams sit back and look at, hey, our goal is to have 6 to 8 players that fit somewhere in these tiers, or how do these play into those evaluations as you look at your roster as a whole? Sure.
I don't have a great sense as far as how formal teams are in kind of putting that kind of a numerical value on it. Again, that was something that I kind of did as an extension because I kind of got frustrated with sort of the squishiness of and also to answer the question, historically, how good do we need to be? Mm-hmm. Okay, if we do not have a tier 1 guy, what else do we need? Okay, well, you need to have 3 or 4 guys in the top 3 tiers and, a couple guys in tier 4 and a couple guys in tier 5. So you got 8 or 9 dudes weighted towards the higher end. Historically, those are the teams that kind of do well. So, but it's as much, I think, about being as realistic as possible as about where your guys are. And then you don't necessarily, okay, we need, 1 of these and 2 of those and 1 of these. It's just okay, Brooklyn has this, we have this. How close are we? And it's very, I can speak from experience, it's very tempting to shade your own guys up a little bit. And it's pretty easy to see how that gets you into trouble pretty quickly. And so that's where almost I like to call it the Russian judge aspect of it comes in. Is just, nope, down. If they win in doubt, push them down. Yeah. Because, from a team building standpoint, what's the downside of thinking, no, we got to get better.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, maybe a name like Eric Bledsoe maybe have fallen in that category in the past with the Bucks.
I was actually I thought he was very good for us. So I'm not here to take shots at Bledsoe.
I'm just busting your balls.
No, it's there was some they're the last time I did this exercise, kind of internally was after the 2019 playoffs, and that was sort of, there are questions now because it was sort of 2 postseasons in a row where there were some questions, and then it became obviously after the 20 playoffs just untenable. And that's to a large part why he's, no longer on the tiers is the playoffs were a problem and didn't really work out well for him in New Orleans. Not totally his fault. They didn't make a lot of sense as a team last year. I think he has a pretty good chance to rebuild his reputation this year with the Clippers, though. So we'll see.
Well, we'll get you out of here with one last question here,
sure.
Seth. Give us one player that you expect to outplay their tier from this list.
Oh boy, one player. RJ Barrett. No.
Pick a Celtic player if you want.
Someone who I expect. So someone I know I'm wrong about.
Someone you expect to grow. Someone you expect
someone I expect to okay. Someone I expect to grow. I think LaMelo. LaMelo is someone I expect to grow. Zion is someone who, if he stays healthy and they at some point put a sensible team around him, I think he's also someone. Those are 2 of the big ones. If Anthony Edwards continues to show what he kind of did towards the back half of last year, it's generally it tends to be the younger guys.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Tend to it's sort of like it's the tides, they come in and out. It's sort of the same way with players' careers. They get higher up the shore, and then at a certain point,
start
they
drifting back.
they kind of drift back out. Yeah.
Well, awesome, man. We'll have to check in with you next year for sure when we do go through the tiers, see if there's any changes that we have. But we really appreciate you joining us today. Like I said, this is a very similar concept Greg and I have been discussing all year. So when I saw this come across my athletic membership, I had to absolutely reach out, get you on the podcast to talk about it. So
Sure.
Really appreciate you joining us. Anything that you got going on that you want to hype up, promote right now?
I have a book coming out in November.
Nice.
It's called The Mid-Range Theory. It's discussing how analytics have grown and shaped with the NBA and over the last 20 years, and probably a demystification of what analytics actually means and how it has and hasn't affected the game in line with, trends in strategy and player skill sets and rule changes. So I had a lot of fun writing it. I would not recommend trying to write a book during a basketball season while also covering said basketball season. That's a mistake I will not make again. But it comes out November 2nd from Triumph Books, and it is available for pre-order on every possible avenue. Amazon,
go get your
Barnes
copy
Noble,
now.
Bookshop.org. Please do.
All right, man. Well, we'll have to grab a copy ourselves and then maybe bring you back on to talk about that here in the near future. But appreciate you taking some time to join us here today. For everybody listening, that's going to wrap it up for this edition of Green with Envy. As always, 5-star review, follow, subscribe, rate. We appreciate the love that all of you guys give us out there, all the feedback. Let's keep it positive. We don't really want to hear on that negative shit, but send us all the positive feedback you got. That'll make our day. Greg, any final thoughts? And then go ahead and send us on out of here as you always do.
No, man, this was a lot of fun. I'm definitely going to get a copy of the Mid-Range Theory. That's a great name, by the way. Unbelievable title.
I've had that in my back pocket since it was the second place finisher when we started Nylon Calculus back in the day. Mid-Range Theory was the second place name for the blog. So I kind of kept that in my back pocket for a rainy day, and here we are.
Hey, it worked out. Definitely going to get a copy. We appreciate you, man. And all the listeners out there, thank you for listening. And we're going to play you out with some Black Sheep Optimists. Peace.